Hey guys, this is Josh here with Trillium Wild Edibles, and today I want to bring you a book review on Eating Wild Japan, Tracking the Culture of Foraged Foods with a Guide to Plants and Recipes by Winifred. This is a really awesome book. I just got through reading it. This book is extremely new. It was published in 2021, and it just came out like within the past couple of weeks. I spent a few days reading this book, and I gotta say, I really enjoyed this book. This book covers a lot of the history of foraging in Japan from ancient times all the way up into modern times. So, without further ado, let's take a look inside this book and see what we've got. There are about 280 pages in this book, and as you can see here, it uses pretty good sized text, so it makes it a very easy read. This book is comprised mainly of 5 different sections or collections of essays on wild foraging in Japan, all throughout different regions. In the beginning of the book, there is an introduction, and throughout this introduction, she gives you a lot of the things that she went through, kind of summarizing a lot of the things she went through whenever she was out in Japan visiting various cultures. Throughout this book and the essays, she travels throughout various regions of Japan and rural areas to experience their traditional cultures of foraging wild foods, or as they call sansai. This is a really good read, and it really does set the tone for the book. This author, Winifred, she does an amazing job at really pulling you in to the story, and it just really well written. I honestly had a hard time putting the book down, just because it's so good. It's so enthralling and gripping as you're reading this book. I mean, and it starts off good in the introduction, and it just does not let up with the good stuff. After we get through the introduction, which is a few pages, we get into the essays on eating wild. Now, there are 5 different sections here throughout these essays. The first one is the first greens of spring, common weeds and woodland wonders. Throughout this section, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but what she does is she covers some of her time staying and visiting with several people in rural areas of Japan to see what types of common weeds and stuff that they would find out in the middle of the woods. Stuff that they would find along their houses and in their gardens and in their fields. And she not only covers just how they forage it, but she covers the history of these specific plants that she talks about. She picks a few plants to talk about a lot more heavily in these essays. But she covers them very well, the history of them through ancient times and all the way up through modern times, the ecological impact of foraging, and she also talks about the ecological impact of agriculture and industry upon the foraging culture of Japan. As we saw before we looked at that, there is a map of Japan with the different regions that she has visited, so this is also really helpful to kind of give you an idea of where she was at in Japan and what types of foods are most commonly foraged within these regions. Now, in each section, there are hand-drawn illustrations by Paul Pointer, and some of them are going to be very simple, like this one about cooking tempura, but others will actually show you tools that are used by traditional Japanese foragers. See, like right here, it shows a common collection tool for the Japanese horse chestnut, which is the second section of the book that covers the rise and fall of the Japanese horse chestnut and how it went from being a big, huge staple of food amongst people in Japan, along with acorns and other things like that. And it also covers how agriculture and industry, like mining, for example, had really shaped the prevalence of the horse chestnut tree as a wild food, and also the occurrence of horse chestnut in the wilds of Japan. So this section was a really good read. Now, as you're reading through these sections, you're going to notice that she's going to talk about how some of these foods were prepared while she's visiting with these people. And sometimes she's visiting in their homes or going to their restaurants that they have. And honestly, while reading through these sections, you're going to learn a lot about Japanese cooking and Japanese history and Japanese culture. You're even going to learn about how politics and, in some cases, even religion played a part in the shaping of foraging throughout Japan. Now, the third section is Feast and Famine, the split personality of a globe conquering fern. And throughout this section, she talks a lot about the bracken fern, especially, but also the ostrich fern, and how common they are in Japan and how commonly they're actually eaten. Here in America, we think of the bracken fern as being poisonous, which it is poisonous by all accounts. And in this, she gives explanations on how traditionally Japanese people have prepared the bracken fern for food by boiling it in basically a very alkaline substance like baking soda or lye or wood ash, for example. Now, the fourth section is titled The Tallest Grass in the World, Tales of Bamboo, Wild and Tame. And throughout this section, what she does is she talks about, well, bamboo shoots and how ubiquitous they are in Japanese culture and Japanese restaurants. She talks about the ins and outs and the nuances of harvesting and preparing them, and even how they will grow them commercially, even for food. And throughout this, she talks about her love for bamboo shoots and flavor. And she actually went to a restaurant, and I find this really funny, but she went to a restaurant where they had an 11-course meal about bamboo shoots and all focused around bamboo. Then, after eating it all, she got tired of eating bamboo. She was like, I don't want any more bamboo basically for the rest of the year because she ate so much of it. Now, the fifth and final collection of essays is titled Seasons of the Sea, A Vanishing Tradition of Wild-Crafted Seaweed. And just like the title implies, it covers the history of foraging and wildcrafting seaweed throughout ancient times and contemporary modern times, and how this practice of collecting seaweed and utilizing it for food is, well, starting to vanish amongst the traditional peoples of Japan. And it's also starting to see a resurgence in more modern times as well. She also covers the impacts of the, Fukushima disaster and how earthquakes and stuff will affect foraging from the sea. Now, towards the very end of each section of essays, you're going to find a recipe that focuses on basically one of the things that she covers in each section, or the main focus of each section. And this is really, really awesome. These recipes are really in depth. I have not been able to try any of them because most of the stuff is not available where I live because, well, it's for Japanese foraging. But she also gives you a counterpart that you can most likely find in the Western world or here in America, or even other wild plants. Like in the first section, she actually talks about that you can use garlic mustard leaves in place of the other plant that she talks about in that recipe. So whenever you're reading these recipes, if you don't have one of the plants that she's talking about, she generally will give you a counterpart that will work or resemble it very, very closely. I actually discovered, wow, there's a lot more creative things to do than even I thought of with wild plants that I didn't really think of. So this will definitely give you some good ideas on how to basically apply foraging in a different way and apply cooking to the wild plants in a different way that you may or may not have thought of. After we go through the collection of essays, she finishes it up with a conclusion of basically her time there researching and studying for this book. And in this, she talks a lot about the Ainu or Ainu, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but the indigenous people of Japan, Japan's northernmost island, Hokkaido. And it's a really, really interesting read on how some of the traditional indigenous people of Japan, how they have basically struggled to survive and thrive, and some of their struggles to basically keep their traditions alive, which is very reminiscent, as I read it, was very reminiscent of Native American tribes, and I'm sure indigenous people all across the globe. So this is a really, really interesting part of the book as well. After that, you have the Endnotes. Now, these are, as you're reading through the book, you're going to see like a small little number, like a 1, like we can see here, and you'll see some of those in the text when you're reading the book. And you flip to the Endnote section to that corresponding number, and then she'll basically back up what she's saying there with either an anecdote or some sort of historical reference. Usually it's a historical reference, and she will give the sources of that as well in these endnotes. After we get through the essays and the endnotes and the conclusion, we get into the guide to plants. Now, in this guide, she makes it very, very clear in the beginning that this is not meant for identification. It only covers a few of Japan's most popular forage foods and forage plants, but she makes it very clear that this is not about identification at all. You are expected to basically consult with a much more authoritative guide for identification if you plan on identifying these plants in the wilds of Japan and don't know what you're doing. You should look for a more authoritative foraging guide that gives you that information. One of the reasons that it's not good for identification is A, that wasn't her focus, and B, these line drawings are not going to help you identify a plant. However, these sections are very, very good reads, and I highly recommend to read them to learn more about different plants of Japan and also learn more about even plants that we may forage or find here in America. Just because these plants are in Japan doesn't mean that some of them don't grow here. There are actually quite a few of them that do grow here, or we have a counterpart or a relative that we can find here in the United States. In the guide to plants, it's organized alphabetically, just like we can see here. It starts with A, and it gives the Japanese name at the top. Then it goes to C, etc. So it's organized alphabetically, which is really, really nice. It also gives you the scientific name and some of the other different common names in Japanese. It gives you the availability of where it grows in Japan, which is also really cool. Now, the description, you might be thinking that's going to be a description of what the plant looks like, and it's not really a description of what the plant looks like, but there is a little bit of that. But it's mainly just a description of the plant in a very broad sense, between kind of a combination of the way it looks and some of the ways that it was traditionally used, or sometimes some of the history of the plant. If applicable, she'll talk about toxicity and poisonous lookalikes. She'll tell you how to harvest them, how to prepare them, and she'll even give you some suggested recipes here at the bottom of each section of the plant. And she does this for each one of these plants, and that's really, really awesome to see. After you get through the plant accounts, or the accounts of plants, you're going to see these Japanese terms that are used in the guide. And if you're like me and not very familiar with the Japanese language, this is extremely helpful to really figure out what exactly she's talking about and some of the terminology used throughout the guide, and also throughout the essays as well, throughout earlier in the book. After that, we get into the collection of recipes. There's about 30 pages of recipes here in the back of this book, and honestly, I loved reading this section as well. I loved reading the entire book, but reading these recipes really, really helped me understand some different cooking techniques that I was not familiar with beforehand. And honestly, it gave me some really interesting things to try. Now, throughout each one of these recipes up here, she's going to talk about basically some of the traditions and then some of the differences between American style and Japanese style food. And each one of these descriptions at the top will kind of basically be a precursor to the recipe itself. After that, there is a page titled The Names of Edible Plants, and she gives you the Japanese common name, the English common name, and then the scientific name. Not all of these plants are going to be listed in the guide to plants or in the recipes, and some of them aren't talked about a whole lot in the book of essays or the collection of essays, but this kind of helps give you a little bit more additional information on some of the edible plants of Japan. Of course, after that, there are some selected bibliographies. Now, the Endnotes that we talked about a few minutes ago also have some bibliographies within them as well. And then, of course, like any book at the back, there's, of course, an index. Honestly, after reading this book, I think everybody who is interested in this book should certainly buy it. If you're interested in learning the history of foraging globally or the history of Japanese foraging specifically, I highly, highly recommend this book. Winifred Bird is a great author. She did an amazing job laying this out. The layout of the book is really unique. It's really helpful. It's easy to flip through and find what you're looking for if you're looking for something specific. Honestly, this is a great book. I would really recommend that if you want to learn about the history of Japanese foraging and Japanese culture, even, definitely buy this book. Her writing style is very easy to follow, but it's also very engaging and very in depth. So, I hope this video has helped you guys understand this book, and I hope this helps you to make a good purchase. I thank all of you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.